welcome again to Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific, brought to you, as always, by our friends at Bauer Group Asia. We will tell you more about them in due course. I'm Ray Powell. I'm coming to you from my living room near the Stanford University campus. That's Jim Caruso. He's coming at you from what looks like his office in Tucson, Arizona, which is, I guess, near a very large roadrunner, a coyote armed with Acme products or whatever happens in Tucson. Jim, how are you?
Deep understanding of American geography, which impresses everyone.
I'm better at the Indo-Pacific.
Let's hope.
All right, Jim, who's with us today?
Well, in our time in Australia, we would occasionally work with people in the Australian government. One of those people we worked with a lot was the National Security Advisor to Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. And that is our guest today, Justin Bassi. In addition to being the National Security Advisor for the Prime Minister, he later was Chief of Staff for the Foreign Minister, worked in intelligence, heading up some cyber work, and is now the Managing Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which is one of the premier Australian think tanks. Justin, also good to see you again, my friend.
Jim, Ray, great to see both of you from Canberra, a city that misses you both.
Well, it's a small city, so it's a small miss. All right, we're gonna dive in, and among the things you worked on was the Quad, the grouping of Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, which was pointedly not a defense agreement, but something else. Just yesterday, there was the first Quad foreign ministers meeting with new Secretary Rubio and his counterparts, including Penny Wong from Australia. So, Justin, can you explain to our audience why the Quad matters and why should we be thinking about it?
Well, Jim, great to kick off with the Quad. Obviously, it's great to see the one of the first events that Marco Rubio did as Secretary of State within hours of being confirmed was the Quad. And it was a bit reminiscent of when Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong, a day or within 36 hours of coming into government in 2022, went straight to the Quad leaders meeting in Tokyo in May in 2022. So I think the fact that in so many of these situations that the four countries get together so early in new terms of their respective governments shows how important the body, the grouping is to them. It's had a couple of incarnations. Why is it important? The Quad 2.0 that really began in 2017 with the first foreign ministers meeting in 2019 was brought together and brought back after 10 years of hibernation for slightly different reasons than the first incarnation between 2004 and 2007. The Quad 2.0 from 2017 was the four countries coming together because of China. The countries don't often like to talk about it. And I think a mistake that's been made over the past couple of years is that the Quad countries have tried to downplay that it has any security component at all, and I think that has been a misjudgment. So it was very, very noticeable that the joint statement that came out straight after the meeting yesterday went back into mentioning security multiple times in all domains, and I think is reflective of of what we need from the Quad. And it's early days, but we could be seeing the next evolution of Quad 3.0 of at least recognizing that there is a security component, not that the Quad is only security, but there is a security component. So to go to the importance of it for maritime powers, obviously the major power in the United States, two of its closest allies in Australia and Japan, a very important power in India, most populous country, technologically savvy, all of them wanting to make sure there's stability and security and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific. And to go to the importance of your pod, really is, while there's global uncertainty, these four powers come together to ensure security and stability in this region, where there are so many smaller powers that do rely on us to do some of that heavy lifting.
So, Justin, back in September, you co-authored a piece for the ASPI Strategist, basically arguing for the Quad to grow up. You said that, like a young person entering their third decade, the Quad's time has come to start maturing into its proper potential and making its mark on the world, rather than trying to cling to the safety and comfort of youth. What would a fully mature Quad look like?
It's a very good question, and I think a fully mature Quad does multiple things at once, and indeed, people who've been around the Quad the last since 2017 will be saying, well, there are multiple working groups and lots of work that goes on between the countries, and that's right. But for the Quad to grow up, the Quad can't just be a secrety body of officials working behind the scenes. It needs to show global outward leadership, looking at those areas that provide, unfortunately, the Indo-Pacific with a level of uncertainty. And that means both the very positive side of the Quad around capacity building to ensure that the smaller countries in the Pacific in particular, but the Pacific and Southeast Asia have great options relating to their development of critical infrastructure and communications. But it also means tackling some of the more thorny issues. And that means looking at supply chain security. It means tackling with full transparency, not to poke anyone in the eye, but with full transparency, why we need to have not just secure supply chains, but reliable supply chains, and why we shouldn't just go down a monopoly risk of relying only on Chinese companies for our full supply of goods and services. It means tackling cybersecurity and being upfront with all of our populations that it's not just what we can see tangibly. It's not just terrorism or what we can see in front of our faces. That the world is now digital, and the Quad, as four developed technological powers, needs to deal with issues, specific issues, like what we've seen in recent months with the revelations of Salt and Volt Typhoon, where China is through the American communications network. It's through global critical infrastructure, including Australia's, where they pre-position malware for future the potential for future disruption. Needs to deal with nuclear proliferation. All of these issues need to be dealt with by the Quad, because we are the regional powers, and I think what it requires is, particularly Australia and Japan, and speaking as an Australian, needing to evolve from using describing ourselves as middle powers that effectively allows governments of the day to say, oh, we're just middling and we can't possibly have any influence or impact. And the only issue around the world is great power competition, so it's just the US and China. The Quad means we are greater than the sum of our parts, we are strong collectively, and we should present with full confidence and not be fearful that if we say that the Quad did discuss China, or that the Quad did discuss cybersecurity, or the Quad did discuss critical minerals and how do we ensure secure supply chains, that we're going to face such a level of punishment that we're not going to be able to withstand it. So growing up, becoming an adult Quad or Quad 3.0 requires the Quad to be able to say that we do all those positive capacity building issues, but we absolutely tackle the security issues as well.
I can see that working between Australia, Japan, the United States. We have broad interaction, government to government, across all levels. But India is the outlier. It's not an ally with any of the other parties. And work with India is famously a heavy lift. And there's no secretariat for the Quad. So how do you see this rather long list of to-dos actually being eventuated?
Yeah, and it is a good question. It is commonly, obviously, acknowledged that a difference is that India is not an ally of the US, while Australia and Japan are. But my view is that we are seeing around the world now that you don't have to hark back to traditional alliances to work on security issues. I mean, we are on the other side. If you look at the adversaries, I think the judgment of our respective intelligence communities have had to change over the last couple of years, because I'm sure if we had the intel assessments in front of us today, they'd all be saying from years ago that Russia and China don't trust each other, and one of the distinguishing features between the authoritarians and the democracies is the great advantage of alliances, and that Russia and China simply won't work together because they don't trust each other and they don't have those formal alliances. Well, we've seen that is no longer correct. The No Limits Partnership isn't just words. They are working together. China is the main enabler of Russia's war on Ukraine. They are supporting each other's disinformation. And it doesn't matter that they might not fully trust each other. And that they don't have a what we would view as a traditional alliance. So with the Quad, it's not an alliance. AUKUS is not an alliance, but they are vital, absolutely vital minilateral partnerships that just have to succeed for us to have the security and sovereignty that we need in the future. And so there are baby steps, and you're not going to be able to cover off everything with the click of the fingers. But there are several topics, not just capacity building ones, but several security topics in which the four countries share complete alignment, even though it's not an alliance. Maritime area is one of them. I believe cyber is another. We're all interested, of course, in a range of these issues in critical minerals, supply chain security. You have a look at, you mentioned India, Jim. We're all grappling. The rest of us are grappling with how to deal with Chinese platforms like TikTok. Big debate, obviously, in the United States. Full ban, full divestment, qualified divestment, joint ownership. Australia is a little bit half pregnant, where we're one of those countries that has banned TikTok from government devices. But we haven't explained to the public, well, how is there such a security risk that government officials and government ministers can't be anywhere near TikTok, but the public can? I think there's a problem there. But then you look to India, yes, not an ally, but absolutely aligned. And India has fully banned TikTok. And their society seems to be surviving without TikTok in a way that some in our society think that if we don't have TikTok, it's going to be the end of the world as we know it. So there are these key individual areas that I think partnerships like the Quad can tackle. In fact, can tackle better than some traditional alliances. I'm an alliance guy. It remains an advantage for us. But some of these minilaterals are vital. And we're talking about the Quad, but I would like to think that one of the other minilaterals that the Trump administration not only looks to keep, but to further strengthen would be the Squad with the Philippines. I do think that there's room for these minilaterals, and then we can look at the individual topics to determine which ones need to be dealt with behind the scenes genuinely because of sensitivities, but which ones need to be dealt with publicly. And in the digital age, Jim Ray, my view is that we can no longer take an approach where government says we're going to do everything in secret behind the scenes. We've got to bring the public along. Otherwise, we do have the run the risk of the situation we're in now, where too many of our public do not believe that there's an issue in cyberspace, do not believe there's an issue where the Chinese Communist Party has control over the very platform in which you are getting your information. And even our politicians, we saw a cabinet minister in the UK just 48 hours ago say, well, what's the problem with cat videos? Well, if that's a cabinet minister thinking that the Americans think cat videos are the national security threat, then we've got a problem because the public is going to then enjoy what may very well be quite jokey, but they're going to take that seriously instead of saying it's a full-on propaganda platform that has been used against us, including in relation to the war in Ukraine, effectively being a 24-hour operation for the Kremlin.
Well, fortunately, here in the United States, we don't have any frivolous politicians who downplay the threat. Let's talk a little bit about your colleague there at ASPI and also a friend of the podcast, Ewan Graham, penned an article just yesterday, and he says, absent from the statement, he's talking about the Quad statement, foreign ministers meeting statement that just came out yesterday, is any reference to ASEAN centrality. He says, this is ellipsis is an early indication that the Trump administration does not intend to pursue cooperation through the Quad only at a pace that is comfortable for Southeast Asian countries. All right, so all of my ASEAN centrality friends out in podcast land are having the vapors. Justin Bassi, should they be having the vapors?
I think start with Ewan's first point, which I think was a good one, was that the joint statement was short but sweet. The Quad statements, like so many statements these days, had ballooned out to pages and pages and pages, and I'm not sure many people other than the officials writing them were getting through them. When you have 50 pages, you have the ability to make sure that you use every word in the dictionary to be able to say you covered it off. In a short statement, it can sometimes be harder to write that short statement, but it was succinct and went to the point of why the Quad exists. Should people be worried that it didn't reference ASEAN centrality? The answer is no. We don't need, Ray, to mention ASEAN centrality every single time we have a meeting on something, and not because we don't like ASEAN or the countries in Southeast Asia, but I actually would reverse it. My fear is that it becomes we are so fearful of we've set a precedent where every minister in Australia or other countries are so fearful. If I don't say ASEAN centrality, I'm going to be lambasted. I'm going to be told that I don't care about ASEAN. But if we're not really, if the main focus isn't ASEAN in the actual meeting, there shouldn't be a need to say, oh, by the way, ASEAN centrality. And I think in this case, what we were dealing with was recognition, I think, significantly and importantly from the incoming Trump administration that they wanted to hold the Quad meeting early. I think it was the first big meeting by Marco Rubio. They wanted to come together, express the fact that the Quad was going to be important for the incoming Trump administration, and likely saying behind the scenes to each other, we're going to continue to counter and constrain the worst of Beijing's behavior in the Indo-Pacific. And I think for that reason, the short statement, which mentioned security multiple times, should not be taken as a hit on ASEAN. It should be taken as showing that the Quad will be strong, including for the entire Indo-Pacific. I think it's important that we don't just fall in the trap of saying words just to be able to say that we said it. Because I think we want to, when we do then talk about ASEAN, we want to be able to say that we are talking about ASEAN substantively, not just saying we're giving lip service. So I think there's an opportunity here to take a step back and to say we will still prioritize this region. From an Australian perspective, the Pacific and Southeast Asia is still the top priority. It's our geography. but it's not the only priority, and that we need to work with our other partners to ensure that this region, Southeast Asia and the Pacific, is safe. Another word that I think wasn't in the statement was climate. Again, it shouldn't be taken by people who are focused and passionate about climate security it shouldn't be taken as a sign that the Quad will never discuss or focus on climate issues ever again. The Quad did reference security in all its forms, and in my view, the Quad, the benefit of the Quad, and going to what your first question of what is the Quad, what's its importance, is how does it make each of the domains and each of the fields safe and secure, and that'll include ASEAN, it'll include climate, but we don't have to mention them every single time. And I would say that, and I think Ewan would say this better if he were here. But I think we need to ensure that we are not doing something that we're not hoping and expecting and wanting ASEAN to do for itself, Ray. I think one of the core elements of the Quad will remain in maritime security and will be to ensure that we show our support to the Philippines in its remarkable and vitally important role in standing up to Beijing's aggression. But what we haven't seen is really much public support from ASEAN for the Philippines. I don't know that we could identify one Southeast Asian country that has actually said China should stop bullying the Philippines. And in some reports, we're seeing that some Southeast Asian nations are trying to say to the Philippines, would you stop standing up to China so that we don't have as much tension? So I think we've gone too far in recent years in just paying lip service so that we can say we said words, and we've gone away from actually wanting to bring both our own public on a journey, but also our fellow nations, and to actually give the confidence to those smaller nations that larger regional powers like Australia and Japan are going to be here, and it is safe to stand up for your own security and sovereignty.
So remember back in 2018 when Quad was being stood up again, the ASEAN ambassadors in Canberra were going crazy that you guys are going to make decisions that affect us, but we have no input. And we got a lot of talk, you and I, about that.
Yes.
He said basically, look, you don't even know what Quad is exactly going to be yet, so hold on to your pants. But now it looks like we're moving in a direction where we will be making some decisions that affect them. Would it help if there were an annual meeting of Quad and ASEAN?
Yeah, yes. I'm a believer in increasing the collectives where we can. I love a number of what is, I suppose, in the diplomatic world referred to as the pluses. I think the G7 plus network is vital, where countries like Australia, Korea, India join some part of the G7. I think AUKUS Pillar 2, in its next evolution, needs to identify the countries that are going to work on some of those advanced capabilities, whether it be our other Five Eyes friends like Canada and New Zealand, or it be our vitally important partners in the region like Japan and South Korea. And with the Quad, I think that the evolution of the Quad is not to be a small target and try to assure Southeast Asian and Pacific countries that don't worry, we're not going to do anything that could raise tension, because inevitably, if you take an approach of that is so risk averse, then you're not effective at all. I think it's the approach is to go the other way and to actually prove to the region that it is a force for stability and force for good. And so the Quad should look to other partners. As I said, with the Squad, we could have Quad plus Philippines. We could have Quad absolutely suggest to ASEAN that we work together on issues. And I think it's actually incumbent on the Quad, not just with ASEAN, but with the Pacific, to show the Pacific that the Quad collectively provides an alternative to the strings attached money that China offers and provides. And it can be the Quad as a foursome, or it could be the Quad countries, Australia and the US, or Australia and Japan, or the old trilateral that I still think should be a feature that we revert to in addition to the Quad. At the trilateral strategic dialogue between Australia, Japan, and the US. And I think the Pacific is an example where the Quad and the Quad countries can say, we want to continue working on subsea cables. We want to improve your communications development for your own economic prosperity, because it's also good for our national and regional security. So I think the approach that we should be taking is not to fear referencing the Quad, and we should be upfront with ASEAN, Jim, to say that we're going to reference the Quad where we are working together, and everybody should have confidence that no one is going to be punished for it.
So we want to make sure we have this opportunity with you, since, of course, we were in Australia at the time when you were working at high levels in two governments on issues of common concern, a lot of security issues. And of course, that was during Trump 1.0. You've had the chance to sort of think about what were the approaches to Donald Trump that worked for Australia, for Australian leaders during that period of time. Where was Australia able to advance the ball in meaningful ways? Where were things more difficult? And what could be opportunities as well as risks for this current government in dealing with Donald Trump?
Great question, and both fond memories and repressed memories simultaneously. I remember speaking with Jim about the refugee deal and being calmed, and then about 30 seconds later, a tweet going out saying that it's a bad deal, and wondering what to do next. So I will always value that time that I was able to spend with you guys to discuss the issues of the day. I think it is, though, a very, in all seriousness, a great question, and I do think that sometimes we are seeing people think that this is all new, that Trump becoming president is revolutionary, when in fact we have had 4 years of President Trump to examine and to learn from which we should learn lessons. In my view, and you guys were here to see it and can agree or disagree, but I think Australia managed the first Trump administration better than any other country. Now, who are the other countries that might argue with me? I think Japan would have an argument, particularly under Shinzo Abe, who was very active, and probably India under Modi would argue that they had a very good relationship. But even if that's right, even if India and Japan just is up with us in that category, or in front of how Australia fared, that's the Quad. Going back to the first topic of the podcast, it was the Quad countries, in my view, that had the best, most productive relationship with the Trump administration. And we were able to show that we were genuine partners, not taking advantage of the United States. And from an Australian perspective, I think there were three main reasons. There were many reasons, and I think people to people that the relationships were vital. And I think people forget because obviously President Trump is such a larger-than-life character, but the people around President Trump were absolutely expert in their areas and excellent to deal with, and played a major role in why there were so many good policies taken, particularly from an Australian perspective in relation to China. But what were the three areas that I think put Australia ahead of the rest of the field? One was the trade deficit. We know that Trump is very economically minded, and he believes that those countries that have a trade surplus with the United States are, as a default, are taking advantage of the US. Australia has long had a very large deficit, and that's a good starting point. But I think the mistake that I think some people are making is to put all eggs in that deficit basket, because it wasn't enough to have the productive relationship that Australia had with Trump in the first term. It wasn't the deficit itself is not what got the full exemption from the steel and aluminium tariffs. There were two other areas, substantive areas, in my view, that combined to show that Australia was not a security threat, of course, but was actually an equal partner. One was defence spending. And before President Trump won the election in late 2016, Australia had issued a defence white paper, committed to 2% GDP spending and to continuous shipbuilding for the first time. And so there was a very good story. Now, there have been ups and downs since then, of course, and some of the decisions have changed, including the submarine decision of 2016. But there was a very good, genuine story to tell on defence spending. And the third area, and in my view, the area that was most significant, and something that I discussed with you both at the time, was Australia's approach to China. That Australia's approach to China had begun to shift in 2016 with a confluence of events, recognizing that we were suffering daily cyber intrusions. China was identifying our sensitive critical infrastructure in which to exert influence. It was, of course, 2016 that saw the Hague ruling on the South China Sea. And while it is now commonly known, we started to see and identify and refer in late 2016 to foreign interference. All of these things were happening just before Trump became elected. And of course, then in 2017, we were the first country to begin the process in relation to prohibiting Huawei and other Chinese suppliers from our 5G network. And my experience was that Australia's approach to China policy, which put at risk some short-term economic benefits to make sure that we prioritized our long-term security, was what gained us most respect throughout Washington, D.C., not simply straight to Donald Trump. And a lot of this, the credit absolutely goes to then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull for beginning that shift, when frankly, as Prime Minister, he didn't need to. As Donald Trump came into power, by far and away, the number one security threat was ISIS. It wasn't China's malicious rise. I think probably in 2016, China's rise wasn't even in the top 2 or top 3. North Korea was a higher problem. North Korea was threatening Australia in 2016. So it was a shift in approach that is unusual for prime ministers when we only have 3-year terms in Australia. It was looking to future sovereignty, and sovereignty became more important than the traditional how do we balance economics and security. So those 3 areas together meant that Australia had the respect of everybody in the US, and defence industry spoke up for Australia. Civil society, private sector, everybody spoke up to say Australia is not just a great alliance partner that has fought with the United States in every single war in the past 100 years, and we're the only country to have done so. But that wasn't going to be enough. What have you done for us lately? Well, Australia's had done a lot. Fast forward now to 2025, Trump 2.0. We still have the trade deficit. So again, great starting point. And potentially, I'm sure some in the current government and establishment would be hoping that Donald Trump would be saying, oh, I remember the Aussies, great partner, trade deficit. There's still got a trade deficit. Okay, we'll move on to another country. And that might happen. He's got a lot in his in-tray, more than the in-tray in 2017, because we didn't have war in Europe. We didn't have war in the Middle East. And as I said, it was terrorism that was the main security game. But hoping that we can survive the next 4 years by playing a small target and relying on saying trade deficit is a little bit like trying to say that we're going to have a great relationship with ASEAN by putting ASEAN centrality into Quad statements. We can't just make the Australia-US bilateral relationship. We can't concentrate it on the trade deficit. Use it by all means. It's a fact. And we know that Trump finds it important. But we still have to do our bit in the security fields. Where are we with defense? Well, AUKUS, I know a key topic for you guys. I think it's a key advantage for us. We are investing in defense. But beyond AUKUS, I think we're a bit more wobbly. I think we are not doing enough in some of the key areas that if Trump's team has the time to delve into Australia's spend in defence and security, would see that we have gone in trending in the wrong direction. Space defence and space security is one where we are cutting at the exact wrong time. And then the third area, which I put as most important and is more important now than it even was in 2016, 2017, China policy. We're trending backwards there. That while the government has a political line where it says we'll cooperate where we can, disagree where we must. I think it's hard now to actually list what is in this must disagree category. We are silent on human rights in a way that we haven't been previously. I can't remember the last time a minister mentioned the human rights abuses in relation to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. We are more silent on the South China Sea. We're not willing to say the word China in the bilateral. So the bilateral readout between Marco Rubio and Penny Wong did not use the word China. In contrast, the bilateral between the US and Japan did mention the word China.
Sorry, Justin, just very quickly, I want to tee you up for one more note on that, because you were quite critical of the current government last year after the incident in which a Australian warship was near Japan and was accosted by a Chinese warship, which pinged sonar into the water while Australian divers were in the water trying to essentially unfoul the propeller and were injured in that. And you were critical that the Australian government was relatively muted in its response to that. Can I get you very briefly to talk about why that was?
Why I was disappointed? I think that the Australian government came in 2022, I think, very understandably looking to see if they could lower the rhetoric in relation to the Australia-China relationship that had become very tense. China wasn't taking any phone calls or any meetings at ministerial level. The relationship had broken down. Completely China's fault because of its malicious actions, but it had broken down. And so the new government, looking to take advantage of that change very smartly and I think correctly, working out, can we lower rhetoric while not changing Australian government policy? Very supportive. And I think early on, it was a very strong start in which the language was disciplined, but no change of policy. I think, though, that the problem that all Australian ministers and leaders face, it doesn't matter which party they're from, is that many of them make the mistake of thinking, if I can just get through this next meeting, or if I can just get through this next policy decision, that'll be it with China policy. I don't have to make any more decisions. But there will be another decision that has to be made. You can't just make a 5G decision on technology and think that's China technology done for the next generation. There will be high vision cameras will come up next. TikTok will come up next, and the same in relation to actions below the sea, on the sea, above the sea. That can't just say, well, we've mentioned the Chinese releasing chaff in front of an aircraft. So we did that 6 months ago. So we don't need to mention the fact that they've done it again 6 months later, because we mentioned it already, and we don't really want to have to mention it again. China takes advantage of countries like Australia setting precedents where we don't mention their malicious activity. My strong view is that be country agnostic. Don't just poke China in the eye. But where there is a breach of international rules, norms, or laws, be focused on the activity, on the breach. And that example, Ray, where the sonar pulses were used against Australian personnel, well, that's bad behaviour. And my complaint was my disappointment was that the Australian Prime Minister was seeing President Xi very shortly after that incident. And it was known to the Australian government before that meeting. And that is an occasion where the Prime Minister of Australia absolutely wants to have a good meeting and discuss some positive issues. No leader wants to only go and discuss bad things. But it needed to be mentioned. It needed to say, I've heard reports from my defence team that sonar pulses have been used against Australian Navy personnel. That needs to be dealt with, and that needs to be acknowledged. Doesn't have to end the relationship, but it needs to be acknowledged that this is not going to be accepted. So the news that the Prime Minister had the meeting and did not raise it, that's a problem for Australia. It sets a precedent, because if the three of us were in President Xi's team, we would leave there saying we've got the Aussies where we want them, because we've been able to effectively attack Australian personnel and then meet leader to leader, and it wasn't mentioned. So we're going to be able to push and get away with everything. Let's go full throttle. Let's up the cyber attacks. Let's up the ante in all of these areas, because now we'll be able to say, and as both of you know, because you've been in the positions in embassies around the world, China, the next time that behavior happens, China will remind Australia that we didn't say anything last time, so we cannot say anything this time, because then we would be inconsistent. It's a terrible position for us to be in.
Well, it's awfully good that Australia stood up back when you were working with Prime Minister Turnbull. It's good that the Labour Party of Albanese also stood up, but now seems to be going, as you indicate, in a lesser direction. Is the lack of defense spending an indicator of this lack of focus on China as a threat?
I think why I think we've got perhaps a double problem, Jim, is I think if we were doing this podcast 20 years ago, I think the answer would be that the Australian system didn't see China as a threat, and like so many other countries thought, if we can just involve China in our activities, if we can let them into the WTO and other international institutions, we will change China. But now in 2025, that naivety isn't there, Jim. So it's not an excuse. Ignorance and not understanding the threat isn't there. They get the intel reports. They can see what's going on in front of them. So the full knowledge of the threat is there. which I think in many ways makes it worse. That the system knows that the core national security threat to Australia is from the Chinese Communist Party, but the reality is that we rely on China in two core areas that does separate us, for example, from what the US and Australia and allies went through in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. I love Cold War analogies. There are similarities, but there are differences. A key difference is that we weren't relying on the Soviet Union for our economy or our technology. Right now, though, we have a fear that if we stand up to China, we're going to be economically coerced. I think that we should have taken confidence from the years of economic coercion that we faced and the years of economic coercion that other countries face to say that diversification is not only possible, but it's good for our country. And we should have continued down that path. I think technologically, I'm really concerned, Jim, that we are setting ourselves up to have all of our critical infrastructure and critical platforms controlled by companies that are themselves controlled by a foreign government. Mm. And so I do have those concerns, and that all of those issues are known, and the decisions need to be taken.
That's an excellent note to sort of wrap this up on, but we want to end on a more positive note. So I want to refer you back to the time when you were in government and chargé d'affaires for 2.5 years. Jim Caruso was at the U.S. Embassy running the U.S. mission, and in what we like to refer to as the golden age of the alliance. So after 2.5 years there, he was referred to by Foreign Minister Julie Bishop as, quote, the best ambassador Australia never had. So as your exit question, is that in fact true? Was Jim Caruso the best ambassador Australia never had?
There's only one right answer.
Of course the answer is yes. Look, I think, I truly owe a lot to Jim. Jim, of course, had a great team around him at the time, and I think because of how important Australia is to the US consistently sends good people to Australia, and it'll be very interesting to see who the next ambassador is to Australia. In the meantime, the team here will do an excellent job at the relationship. But there's no doubt that beyond the friendship, that means that I'll only ever say that Jim was the best ambassador we never had and the best chargé there ever has been. And likewise, a pretty fine DA yourself.
It's so true.
The time, I think, though, was we shouldn't forget that it was new in what was happening in 2017. We talk a little bit about technology. The Trump administration came in at a time of technological revolution from a bureaucratic perspective. Trump's use of social media, highly unusual for a world leader back then. Australia was fortunate with Prime Minister Turnbull. He wasn't actually a traditional politician. He was tech-minded, and he was driving already in Australia the Australian bureaucracy to the point of being a bit uncomfortable, using encryption platforms like WhatsApp, saying, "Well, let's use Google Docs." And the fear that you could see in the system of Turnbull not reading his speeches from papers, but Google Docs, which, as a live document, what happens if there's an accidental deletion with one click? So all of those uncertainties for bureaucrats, which we all were, it was new. It means that the work that you guys did was even more significant and to your credit than I think people realize. And very interestingly, every time there would be an administration policy announcement or tweet, I know that Jim's phone in particular would blow up. What does this mean? And Jim would have to carry that balance of being able to, and as you did, Ray, from the defense perspective, but you'd have to carry the balance of absolutely being loyal and support the American position, but then being able to say, well, this is what it means in practice. And so that was done exceptionally well. The relationship that you had back then as charge and with your team, people like John Hennessy Nyland, meant that the relationship, in amongst all of the unpredictability and uncertainty and enjoyable and frightening tweets, was not just, and this is, I think, vitally important for the listeners to understand, Australia just didn't survive the first Trump years. We thrived. And it was in large part because of the team they had in Canberra, and shows why sending strong people to Canberra from the US is so important.
Well, Justin Bassi, all of the goodwill you built up in that final compliment-filled soliloquy, you frittered away by mentioning positively John Hennessy Nyland. So now we're going to have to deal with John as he revels in his glory once again. But
or you might edit it out.
Exactly. We do thank you for a friend of the podcast, John Hennessy Nyland, by the way. We do thank you for joining us. He is Justin Bassi, Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. You can see them over at aspi.org.au. I think you can also follow him on X at Justin Bassi, correct? And anywhere else that they should follow you?
We've got plug for our own podcast, which I'd love to have you guys on. You did one recently around explaining why the Indo-Pacific was so important. It was a great one. Encourage listeners to listen to that as well. I think it was At the Boundary. But ours is Stop the World. But keen for all your listeners who are interested in the Indo-Pacific, the Alliance, AUKUS, Quad, and just global security. Touch base with ASPI whenever you like, and I'm very much hoping that you'll have me on again.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you very much, sir. All right. Well, Jim, we certainly could have gone on and on with Justin. We have so many good memories, so many interesting memories. There were things we barely scratched the surface of. We could have gone much deeper into, but we should probably move this along. What's your favorite memory from when you were in Australia working with Justin Bassi?
Well, I don't know if it's my favorite, but first of all, I just have to say I worked with Justin a lot, to the point that we would talk several times a day, sometimes at odd hours of the evening, to the point that my wife would say, "Oh, you're talking to your work wife again." So, but the story that comes to mind was, you may remember, there was the midwinter ball in Canberra, where all the movers and shakers would get together. It was sort of like the Al Smith dinner in New York, where people come up and roast each other and do little things. And it's supposed to be closed press. I mean, press can be there, but they're not supposed to report it. So I'm there at the table, and Malcolm Turnbull gets up and starts imitating Trump from the stage. Yes. And one of the reporters decides, this makes too good a story. I'm going to leak a video of this.
Yeah.
I get a call from Justin.
Yeah.
What are we going to do? Is it going to take it as a joke? Which, of course, it was meant to be.
Right. I think I remember this.
Yeah, remember that? And
Yeah.
So
I
worked with
for a guy who was as tech savvy as Malcolm Turnbull was, that was an amateur hour mistake. I mean, has he not watched TV in the last decade or so? There's how many of these videos
tables in the Parliament, and of course, as he's making all these Trump jokes, everyone's looking at me to watch my reaction. And I'm thinking, I can't laugh,
right?
So they can't look dour. So I just look confused.
You didn't put on your best Donald Trump scowl?
I think my face would crack.
All right, Jim. Well, that's a great way to end. Just as a reminder to everyone, our producer is, as always, Ian Ellis Jones and IEJ Media. Follow him on X at Ian Ellis Jones and see his fantastic geopolitical graphics. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you check us out on YouTube if you're listening, youtube.com at IP Podcast, or you can listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc., where you can hear our podcasts with the aforementioned Malcolm Turnbull and Ewan Graham and even John Hennessy Nyland. We do love you, John. You can follow us on X at Indo-Podcast and LinkedIn, and you can email us at our email address, Indo-Pacific-podcast at gmail.com. And finally, of course, follow our great sponsor, PowerGroupAsia.com. Tell them that Ray and Jim sent you and that we are very, very grateful for their sponsorship. Until next time, that's us for this time. And thanks for joining us on Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific?